it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.
Well, good morning and welcome to Pellowe Talk. I'm Dave Pellowe, your host, and we're on the Good Source platform and also the Church and State pages. So coming to you through a few channels this afternoon because we have a very interesting topic to talk about right now, and that is something that appeals and is interesting to everybody in Australia, and it really should be. Whether you're left or right and passionate about your tribe, you're bound to have an opinion on religious freedom and the religious discrimination legislation that is currently being proposed by Scott Morrison and Michaelia Cash to the Parliament. Good luck if they can get anything through that Senate this fortnight. However, there are vocal critics of Christianity who are really upset that Christians might be allowed a little bit off the leash. And there are also Christians who are really concerned for justice and freedom for 26 million people, the basic kind that we should be able to take for granted, and is yet one of those areas of society that is perhaps more regulated than just about any other in this modern society. Well, joining me in this conversation is the director of the Human Rights Law Alliance. Now, I first met Martin Iles back when he was the director of this organisation, and it was very new. And of course, being a Christian commentator, I was very interested in a service which would perhaps defend somebody who, expressing a Christian belief, might find themselves in hot water one day. And I do my best to stay out of trouble and not provoke it deliberately. But at the same time, I think what Human Rights Law Alliance is doing for Christians who are facing unfair treatment and discrimination throughout Australian workplaces, and they are many, is an organisation which needs to be supported. And the Good Source, Church and State, and myself personally, this platform and ministry is a financial partner with this organisation. And the website is actually in the description for this video. I'd encourage you to go to HRLA website and become a supporter as well, because this is very important. But the new managing director of the Human Rights Law Alliance is John Steenhoff, and he joins me now. John, welcome to Pellowe Talk.
Good afternoon, Dave. Pleasure to be here with you today and to talk about this important issue.
Now, you recently wrote an article basically summarising it all, and I want to explore your opinions a fair bit more. You're currently defending, probably in your organisation, if not you personally, currently defending a good number of people and have had some success in the past. And I think a really good summation of how bad the issue is on one of your websites. So tell us about australiawatch.com.au.
Oh, thanks, Dave. So australiawatch.com.au answers the question, is there hostility towards Christians in Australian society, and are there any stories about it? One of the recurring themes that we've seen from the commentary on this issue, starting way back at the time that same-sex marriage was being debated and religious freedom was raised as a concern, was where are the cases? Who's facing hostility for their faith in Australia? Just the other day, Channel 9 News interviewed Rodney Croome, who said inquiry after inquiry has established that there are no Christians facing hostility in Australian society. Well, that's not the case. There are. And what we've done is put together Australia Watch, where we've put together a lot of the cases that we've worked on, but also all of the other cases that we could find that others have run from time to time throughout Australia that document Christians facing hostility for their faith. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are many cases of ours that we can't put up because they've been the subject of confidential settlements, or they're involve people who are still employed in jobs where they faced that hostility. So it gives you a small cross-section of the cases in Australia, both famous, like Margaret Court, Israel Folau, Archbishop Porteous, and not so famous, like some of the everyday Australians who come to us and get our help on a day-to-day basis.
Now, one of the people who most of my audience would be familiar with because of his platform on the Good Source and and the fact that he's been a guest on Pellowe Talk a couple of times, is Lyle Shelton. Now, you are defending Lyle Shelton because he's had some lawfare brought against him by some people who he fairly accurately described without any malice or ill will. But, this is essentially a political campaign, and he was a political candidate at the time. Now, tell us about that case, how you're progressing with that. Just give us a brief review, whatever you're at liberty to divulge without jeopardizing the case. And then let's have a talk about how this legislation might help Lyle.
Sure, Dave. We are privileged to be able to help Lyle to defend himself against a vilification claim that has been made in Queensland against Lyle for an article that Lyle wrote that was critical of the Drag Queen Storytime event that was held in Brisbane at the beginning of 2020, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it's almost 2 years ago that event was held. Lyle is a very frequent blogger and did a blog entry about that, in which he talked about how drag queens are unsuitable role models for children in his view, and he supported that with a discussion about the drag queens who hosted that event. It was a very high-profile event that made the news, not least for a counter-protest that was held. And one of the counter-protesters was a young homosexual man called Wilson Gavin. And following on from an absolute firestorm on Facebook about his involvement in protesting and saying drag queens are not for kids outside of the event, he then tragically took his life, and Lyle talked about that as well. Following on from that, the artists, the drag queens who held the event, commenced a vilification claim against Lyle. There was some public Twitter storm from them as they tried to find Lyle to serve him with the papers, and then Lyle has been keeping people regularly updated on his case. The case has gone through the Victorian Human Rights Commission, at which conciliation was held, which was unsuccessful. And now the matter is currently being taken through the Queensland Tribunal. So the Queensland Civil and Administrative Tribunal is going to hear this matter probably sometime next year. We're currently in the process of preparing for that case, getting evidence together, and putting submissions together and dealing with all of the preliminary issues that need to be dealt with before it actually gets to a court. So because the matter is a matter that's in before the courts at the moment, there's limited things I can say about how it's going, where it's going.
Sure.
Those things can't be...
Let's talk about the claims that these people have made against Lyle. And actually, you know what? I want to just shelve that, bookmark that, and we'll come back. We'll come back to my next question,
Sure.
which is, will this legislation help Lyle? Let's go back to the legislation before that, though, the proposed legislation by the Morrison government, and just outline what it proposes to do and what it actually does do for those of us who may have only had information from the lying harlot media.
Oh, how much time do you have, Dave? This has a long and tortuous history, but effectively what this legislation does is to make religious belief and activity a protected attribute from discrimination. It is largely a cut and paste of legislation that protects other attributes like sex, gender, pregnancy status, race, that have been protected for a long time at federal level by federal legislation. Religious belief, religious activity hasn't had that protection. There has been absolutely no protection for it at a federal level. And that is particularly important for places which also don't have protection at state level. So that's New South Wales and South Australia. So it is actually legal for a business in New South Wales to say this business will not serve people of the Jewish faith.
Wow.
They could turf out Jewish people from their cafes for reading the Torah or for presenting in Jewish religious dress, and there would be no legal redress for that. And that's not something that not many people know. Now, there's a little better protection in South Australia, but not much. There's protection for discrimination on the basis of religious dress. So what this...
If I can just interrupt, add a comment there, I actually don't think discrimination law is very useful altogether. I think it's something that cultural maturity should enforce and not legislation. However, we do live in a society where it is expected that the immorality of discrimination will be prevented by legislation. And so it's just ridiculous that in a society which expects you to make illegal private businesses discriminating against homosexuals and people because of race and other such unkind behavior, that kind of discrimination is totally okay. Religious discrimination, where people, I mean, and certainly being Jewish is both ethnic and religious. But I know for me, Christianity, in not the flaky way that is now associated with wokeism, but Christianity is my identity. It is intrinsic to who I am, and it would be an absolute violation of myself to have to apologize or compromise or disown any part of that.
Yes, and actually, our Prime Minister Scott Morrison expressed exactly the same sentiments that you're expressing in his second reading speech of the bill when he introduced it in Parliament yesterday. Some of the aspects of that speech are just fantastic in their encapsulation of what faith means to Australians and how much of a bedrock it is to a free society, and why this bill is something that's important. And I completely understand your hesitancy around discrimination acts. In an ideal world, if you're looking at giving a particular group a shield against the swords that are pointed against it existing in the law, the answer is not to put necessarily a sword in the hands of those people or a shield, but maybe to get rid of some of the swords that are pointed against it. Maybe what we would have would be less law rather than more law. But you also have to work within the context.
Just lost your internet for... So I've got you back now. Apologies, everyone. Yeah. That was, I think, my internet connection. NBN is working wonderfully in southeast Queensland. Something on that note, and one of the reasons I don't think the invasion of government into this space is necessary or helpful is I'm aware that prior to civil rights legislation in the United States, the social pressure was already forcing segregation of companies. For example, there was lunch counters in the Woolworths stores. And they were already integrating people before the government told them that they had to. And that was based on grassroots activism, the society and culture saying that's not good enough anymore. So we are capable of doing this without legislation, and that's a good thing. But
and the flip side of that, Dave, is that law is not going to magically fix issues that you see in the culture. I think if Correct. You were to look at the reactions that we've seen to the religious discrimination bill, there's been a torrent of very little concealed hatred towards people of faith, a real animosity by people who are regular cultural despisers of Christianity in particular, and who see no place for faith in the public square in Australia. And a law against discrimination just won't fix that.
Mm. So what are the things this bill is actually achieving should it be passed? What does it actually offer in the way of protection to people of all faiths in Australia?
Okay, so in many ways, Dave, the bill is completely unremarkable in that it just cuts and pastes similar provisions to bills that protect sex, race, etc. In fact, in many ways, a Christian will have less protection than people under those bills. Looking through the bill, there are some provisions, I won't bore you with the technical details, that give Christians less protection and certainly say than a person with disabilities. But what it does is it allows a person to take a complaint if they feel that they've had unfair treatment because of their religious belief. And that can either be direct treatment where someone says, hey, you're a Jew. I don't like Jews. I'm not renting my apartment to you. Or it could be indirect discrimination where they put in a rule that seems facially neutral, but which is going to be disproportionately in its effect on people of different religions. So if they were to say all staff must report on Sunday morning for the weekly debrief on the past week, they must log in by Zoom or something, and you have someone who is a Christian who observes the Sunday as a day of rest and won't work on that day. The rule seems neutral on its face, but it's not. It disproportionately affects Christians, and so it will also protect people in those circumstances as well. So the first thing you have to do for a discrimination claim is first show that you've faced unfair treatment, either directly or indirectly. And then it has to be in one of the areas of public engagement that's protected, like education, employment, the rental of space or the provision of accommodation, and all of those kinds of areas. Then the other thing that often these laws have is balancing clauses, because you can't just make an absolute rule against religious discrimination that applies to everyone. You don't want to require a mosque to have to take the application for a preacher from a Presbyterian like myself, right, or from a Jew. You don't want to force a Jewish rest home that's taking care of aged Jewish people to have to employ a Muslim who presents as a Muslim to service the Jewish clientele. You don't want to force a Christian school to have to hire a rabid LGBTQ advocate who is going to come in and teach contrary to the core beliefs and fundamental beliefs of that school. So it's got the standard balancing clauses that you would have in any other discrimination act, and indeed have in all the rest of them. And yet, as you will have seen in the news, a lot of those provisions are the ones that are really causing a furor and a scaremongering campaign against the opponents of religion and Christianity.
But what are those people saying in their scaremongering campaign, which is manifestly untrue to any intellectually honest understanding of this bill?
Okay. So one of the big issues that they're saying is that this is going to give schools free rein to fire gay teachers.
Yeah, Trent Zimmerman said something like that on the news last night or this morning. He was very concerned, and he's not sure that they're going to be safe.
Yeah, well, that's completely irresponsible, and it's completely untrue. And Trent Zimmerman knows that the attribute of sexuality is protected under the Sex Discrimination Act, and that you cannot fire someone on the basis of their sexuality, and that the Sex Discrimination Act is not changed by this religious discrimination bill, and won't be. Mm-hmm. So that is a complete furphy, and it's one that's been rolled out every time. The opposition campaign to the earlier exposure drafts of the religious discrimination bill had exactly the same talking points. Another talking point that there is that this bill privileges religious speech and will enable a Christian to impromptu deliver a fire and brimstone sermon to anyone they meet, wherever they are, whenever, to whomever. So the example that gets trotted out is that a principal of a school will be able to go to a female employee and say, God requires women to stay at home and have babies, and you shouldn't be working here, which is complete and utter nonsense. The law clearly exists for employers and for organizations that says you must follow the reasonable directions of your employer, that you must carry out your work obligations in a way that is respectful to people around you. There are infinite codes of conduct about what you can and cannot do at work. And this bill will not change that in any way, shape, or form. And if you're rude to someone at work, regardless of whether you put in a Bible verse or not, you're going to get fired. You're going to get disciplined. You're going to get all of the usual things that would happen now will happen to you after the passing of this religious discrimination bill. And what people try to do is pretend like the mere introduction of this bill is going to supersede every other existing law in the Australian law books, when in fact, this is going to sit alongside every single other law that we have and integrates with them in a way that doesn't result in massive wholesale changes that will suddenly allow Christians to be bigots who express themselves how they want and can take cover under their supposed religious beliefs. Again, that's complete scaremongering, and it's not justified, but it seems to be a very prominent message that's being repeated in the media.
So it's fair to say, and I guess comment, that the opposition of this bill is political in nature and has absolutely no appreciation for the substance. They would just be opposed to any bill which suggested religious conviction should have any kind of freedom in Australia. They just don't want Christianity to be free, and the facts are irrelevant and not going to get in the way of their wonderful storytelling.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a number of different motivations that people may have. I'm sure some of it is based on animosity towards religion. Some of it, I think, is based on a misreading of the bill. And indeed, there are some provisions which on their face may seem to provide a lot more protection, say, to Christians than they actually do. There are some provisions on their face which seem to extend a lot further than they actually do. And it's only when you read the bill in its entirety and look at all of the balancing clauses and exclusions that have been made that you will realize that those statements aren't true. I think there are some people who are just really engaging in political advocacy rather than real analysis of the provisions of the bill. Yep. And that's unhelpful. And hopefully they just go back to that scaremongering well too many times and people start realizing that it's just a scare campaign and nothing more.
Very, very henny penny of them. What does this bill fail to do? Where is its inadequacies in protection?
Well, it's important to be balanced here and to not try to ascribe to the bill more than what it sets out to do. The promise made by Scott Morrison at the last election was to plug the gap. This was not a very high-level commitment on religious freedom and certainly wasn't supposed to address all of the issues. So he's just plugging the gap with a religious discrimination bill that's largely identical to other bills that protect other attributes. Disappointingly, the bill doesn't incorporate a lot of the recommendations that were made in the Ruddock Religious Freedom Review. So an expert panel in the wake of the same-sex marriage decision was charged with looking at religious freedom in general and saying, how should this be? What is the situation on the ground in relation to religious freedom, and how should it be treated in law? What's a program going forward to address this issue? And they made several recommendations in that review, including one that this kind of law should be passed. That was just one of the recommendations. But in looking at this law, they said that this law should recognize peculiarities about the actual practice of religion and reflect the international covenants that protect religion. You know, religion is a fairly unique attribute. It's something that international law recognizes at a far higher level than other rights, such as the right against discrimination. I mean, it's just completely different. And it's one thing that is practiced not just alone, but together with others. And the law should recognize the protection goes not just to the individual for what they believe in their head, but also for the communal expression, because religion only exists in communities. The other thing is that The law recognises that religion is something that is not just private, but has a public dimension and involves proselytization and the spreading of that religion. And yet, if you talk to the average Australian, they would support the protection of religion and recognise that people of religion don't get a fair go, but they would often express the idea that religion has no place in the public square simply because they've heard it so many times, not realising it's completely out of step with international law. And the Ruddock Review said we should be passing laws that better reflect the position of religion at international law. And this bill doesn't do that. And I think it would have faced significant headwinds because the cultural zeitgeist is against that. So it's unremarkable. It plugs a gap. It should really be passed simply and should have come much earlier in the legislative timetable for this government. But it's here now, and that's what it does do. What doesn't it do? Well, there's been much noise about the removal of the so-called Folau clause, which was speech protection for employees, that employees would be able to speak their religious views in private or to in their own personal time and not be subject to draconian control by their employers. I think you can see that the attempts to placate the critics of this bill have failed miserably by removing that clause.
Yeah, that's true.
And they have said exactly the same things they were saying when the clause was in. You know, they haven't come back and said, we recognise that the government has tried to achieve balance here and we don't get everything we want in this bill, but we now agree that it's in a better shape to be able to proceed through with bipartisan support. No, they've doubled down on their attack, which suggests that their original objections to protection for employees was not motivated by any analysis of the legislation, but just a general hostility towards faith.
Yeah, appeasing those people is something that's often an exercise in futility, and so you just really it's that old ratcheting effect. They're just happy to take one step forward as long as we're always taking 10 steps backwards.
Yeah, that seems to indeed be the case, and it seems to be effective at achieving an outcome.
What is there to be said for the status quo? What would be the hypothetical legal advantages of just walking away from this on the balance of pros and cons?
I guess you would be postponing the battle to another date. And a battle postponed is a battle that might have a better outcome. And look, to be honest, this is a really good question and one that I am completely unprepared for and haven't thought about.
I'm sorry, we can move along if it's too hard.
I've been dealing with what is rather than what ought, or
right. It's more for the professors amongst us.
Well, there are people who really don't like this proliferation of laws that are going into this field of protection of particular attributes, and thus encroaching on the general freedoms of others. And I recognise that, and people who say this bill is going to limit religious freedom more than it's going to protect it. I think there was an article by Peter Credlin about this in The Australian just the other day, and she put forward a case for the fact that this could be a two-edged sword, that it's not just something that's going to protect people of the Christian religion, but it's also going to be one that protects all people who espouse to be religious. I should read it again so I can give a better précis of it than I just have.
Let me interject here. The final arbiter of many of the decisions and applications of this bill won't actually be proper judges, but the Human Rights Commissioner. Is that a correct understanding, or is that a false rumor I've heard?
Well, it's partially correct. So the starting point for any sort of complaint of religious discrimination will go through the Australian Human Rights Commission. They don't have judicial powers per se. That's their job to conciliate. And if that's unsuccessful, then it will go up to a tribunal. And the tribunals, from there, you could make your way right to the High Court. So it could be that the final arbiter of these things is the High Court, and probably will be the High Court.
Is it possible that an unfriendly, let's say, hate theist human rights commissioner, someone who has a real axe to grind against Christians, not unforeseeable in the current political landscape, is it possible that they could nip something in the bud that was a legitimate case and thereby neuter the alleged protections and freedoms?
Yes, so it's going to be a religious discrimination commissioner is established as part of this bill. So there'll be a specific person who is dedicated to religious discrimination. And if you had someone in that position who was actually hostile to religious freedom, there are powers under the Human Rights Act to be able to reject claims, with limited capacity for those who've been rejected to be able to progress that claim forward. But I'm not sure that it's a valid concern or one of the highest concerns that one would have.
Okay.
Although making sure that we do have a person who understands religious faith as the religious discrimination commissioner is important, and someone who is going to be a good voice for religious Australians and recognise that primarily in Australia, religious Australians are Christian or Catholic Australians. So.
Okay, let's get back to the question that I had maybe half an hour ago, 20 minutes ago, and that is, if enacted as is, I think we've already established this bill would certainly not protect Israel Folau. But how would it protect Lyle Shelton, who, in his capacity as a political candidate and a political commentator, made criticisms about the appropriateness of adult erotic entertainers reading children stories in publicly funded venues?
The short answer is this bill might still protect Israel Folau, and we can bookmark
really?
that and talk about it in a second.
Okay, I got that wrong.
No, that's fine. But it would not materially change what Lyle Shelton is facing as a vilification claim under the Queensland Equal Opportunity Act. So there is a provision in this bill that will give limited protection, in limited circumstances, to claims that are made under state law against people who make a moderate statement of their beliefs. This is what's been called the Porteous Clause. There was a case during the same-sex marriage campaign where Archbishop Porteous, who was the Catholic Archbishop, wrote a document that outlined the Catholic position on sexuality and marriage. He distributed that to Catholics in Catholic schools, and an activist got a hold of it and objected to the fact that a Catholic would try to tell Catholics how to be Catholic, and said that this was offensive under the Tasmanian Act, which allows you to take action when you feel that you've been offended. And looking back on that, the federal government said, we don't think that is really a good use of these kinds of laws, and has said we're going to protect people from that by allowing them to make moderate statements of belief. If you're just talking about Catholic doctrine and its implications, you shouldn't have to sit on the back end of one of these complaints. Now, really, this is something the Tasmanian government should have fixed a long time ago.
Amen.
So that the federal government's come in. It pretty much only protects you under that against that particular Tasmanian provision. It's got some broader protections for if you face a discrimination claim for something that you've said. Now, most of the time in most jurisdictions in the states and territories, you do not get a discrimination claim for saying something that people don't like. You will get what Lyle's got, which is a vilification claim. And that is not that you've treated someone unfairly by what you've said. It's that what you have said subjects that person to ridicule, or could subject them to ridicule, hatred, or contempt. because of your public act. Now, those vilification provisions are completely untouched by the Religious Discrimination Bill. It will not protect you in the states and territories from a complaint like the one that Lyle has faced. How it will protect Lyle is if Lyle gets treated unfairly because of his religion when he applies for a job or goes and gets himself accommodation or tries to put his children into a school, etc. So
it does seem to be wholly inadequate because, I mean, we're certainly aware of that kind of frivolous prosecution lawfare from people claiming hurt feelings, which is an impossible test to disprove. And yeah, it's manifestly inadequate. Of course, should be able to ridicule other people. It's the whole point. If somebody says something absolutely ridiculously stupid and ignorant, ridicule is sometimes an entirely appropriate response, as per many of the politicians in Australia that each of us. I mean, surely everybody finds half of the parliament ridiculous, even if it's the opposite half. Inadequate if it can't protect against that kind of lawfare.
Well, I'm not a big fan of ridicule or contempt or hatred, but I do question whether having laws to deal with that is the most effective way of doing it, rather than having social pressure. And the usual social mechanisms that deal with when you've got someone who's a nasty bully, there are social conventions and pressures that will stop them from being a bully rather than having to drag them into a tribunal.
100%. And where I think it's appropriate and not rising to the definition of a nasty bully is that what you'd call the old thing of the court jester, where there was this permission to ridicule power all the way up to the king who held his life in your hands. And today we've got a similar thing with just comedy acts and routines, and the use and employment of certainly satire in political commentary. So many of these things could be passed off by somebody who was the target of them as nasty bullying, when that just isn't the case. It was, robust political communication, which can be a bit bruising sometimes. So that's my. I'm not advocating for people to be nasty bullies, and I certainly don't applaud it. And you're also right in your observation that social remedies are a better cure. As ineffective as they will be, I think the problem is that some of these people are looking for perfect solutions, and there's no legislation that can fix the heart.
No, that's true.
All right. Do you want to tell us about any of the current issues that HRLA is defending, which we, the Australian supporters for freedom, free speech, and basic human rights, such as religious freedom, should be aware of, and aware that you're fighting on our behalf with little to no lying harlot media attention?
Well, thanks for that, Dave. I mean, in the context of the Religious Discrimination Bill, there are definitely cases where the passing of that bill is going to give Christians a peg on which to hang an action where they are treated unfairly. In New South Wales particularly, we've had cases of security guards who've been fired for expressing their faith in their own spare time in a way that their employer took affront to and fired them. We've got people who have been kicked out of associations for expressing their beliefs, etc., in New South Wales, and have not had recourse to any protection for their religious freedom. You remember the case of Israel Folau, of course. There was no protection for his religious beliefs. He didn't have a discrimination act to come under. He had one protection under the Fair Work Act that prevented him from being fired for his religious beliefs that he had to use as the basis for his campaign. And if it's hard for a guy who's famous, has got resources and a public who watches his every move, it's doubly as hard for your average Australian who doesn't have any of those
Right.
things. So there's going to be some real cases of people who will benefit from this bill. But there's also a whole category of people who we work with who just will not be helped by this bill. And that's largely in places where very hostile legislation is being passed that's directly targeting the religious faith. And I'm thinking particularly of the conversion therapy laws that have been passed recently in 2 states in the territory of ACT. I'm thinking of the removal of protections in discrimination statutes for schools to allow them to operate in accordance with their conscientious beliefs and operate their schools according to the clear orthodox biblical teachings of the Bible, and give the parents and the churches who operate those schools the atmosphere in which they can stand against all the awful things that characterize our society, the individualism, the preoccupation with sexuality. We really are becoming a community that prioritizes sexual urges and hedonism above all else as an absolute good, and now forcing our religious communities to also take that view, and they simply don't. So what does our work involve? I mean, we've acted for a foster couple in Western Australia who were rejected. Their application was rejected because of their orthodox beliefs on sexuality and gender, even though they were only going to foster children below the age of 5, where the issue simply couldn't arise.
Wow.
But as soon as they talked about their faith, they got given the kibosh. Do not pass go, do not collect $200, and were kicked out the door. That case has been heard in the tribunal in Western Australia at the beginning of this year, and we're expecting a decision very shortly. It was a 12-day trial. We engaged very good counsel. What we want to do is resource these religious freedom cases well. A lot of the cases that have been run in the past have been run on a shoestring and have been a dollar short and a day late, not because of the bad will of the people involved. There were some great people who've put their shoulder to the wheel and done a really good job, but because there wasn't the infrastructure there to run the cases well. So we want to take good cases. We want to get the best clients in front of the court, and we want to use good lawyers to get some good results. And our aim is not to magically change society by running strategic cases. You can never do that. Society is changed by the gospel. All we want to do is make sure that the legal atmosphere is such that Christians still have some freedom to express the gospel freely and to do what God calls them to do, which is to transform the society by making disciples of the world. So that's our role.
Very good. I want to encourage everybody to jump on the website, HRLA.org.au, and become a donor if you can. There's many good causes to donate to in this fight to infiltrate and win back the culture and political activism. The Good Source is certainly one of those. But HRLA is something that I donate to, and this ministry and platform donates to. It is an investment in making sure we have the resources on the good guys' side, on the side of right-thinking people, and on the side of righteousness, to make sure that people of Christian faith and conviction can actually have some support when they face unfair treatment in their workplaces and society in general. So hrla.org.au, get on it and get familiar with it. And a small monthly amount times 100, 1,000 of us will make a big difference. And of course, they're also looking for lawyers to join their alliance if that's something you might be interested in as well. John, is that a fairly good summary?
That is, and we appreciate donations. A lot of small donations add up to a lot of support to run cases which aren't cheap. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one of the upcoming cases that we have is for Dr. Jereth Kok, who is a Chinese Australian doctor in Victoria, who was suspended and has been suspended for over 2 years from practicing medicine, not for anything he did to a patient, not for any way that he interacted with another doctor, but purely on the basis of Jereth's social media posts. The medical board has pursued him. on a variety of fronts, but the key one being that a lot of the posts that he posted on social media that expressed his deeply held convictions on the usual issues, life, identity, sexuality, etc., were unbecoming of a doctor. And this has meant he's not been able to work, he's not been able to support his family, and he's got a campaign to raise money for his case. That's at Give, Send, Go. You can type in Jareth Cock and find him there if you want to give to his case. If you
that link's on your website.
We don't have a link on our website at the moment, but you can find it if you go to Give, Send, Go, and you could probably find a link and share it on your website as well, Dave. But
sure.
Jareth is going to be the next case that comes up as an example of the overreach into the personal lives of our professions.
I'd love you to keep us in the loop on cases that resolve and the victories. It's good to share the good news of the wins that you're having, and I guess losses as well. I know you're extremely busy, but if you can include us in your chain of press releases, at least, if not a quick interview about results that are encouraging and exciting, that'd be good. I know of another Christian doctor who I can't name because of the threat to his career, hasn't lost his license yet, but there was a complaint made by an activist, not a patient, made by an activist, not even in this country, but somebody from America contacted AHPRA and said, I don't like this doctor's opinions about bioethics, that is abortion.
Yep.
And
I'm aware of the case.
He should be punished. And AHPRA made him go through re-education, very communist. And
at his own
he
cost,
had to jump through a whole heap of, and he had to go through.
At least the Russians had the good sense to pay for the gulags themselves. You didn't have to pay your own way through.
That's right.
But all of these re-education things that I'm speaking tongue in cheek, of course, but it is a cost. I don't want to, compare anyone to the Russian gulags, but it is an indignity when you're told you need to be re-educated and you're going to pay for it yourself.
It's not just an indignity, it is a cancer on quality of care and science when unapproved opinions are more regulated than the malpractice that these things were set up for, where there's actual patient harm. But a doctor who expresses concern about the life of one of his patients or potential patients, the people that the 1948 Geneva, World Medical Association, in their updated physician's oath, swore to protect. The whole world agreed after the horrors of World War II that life should be protected from conception. And yet, in their infinite wisdom, today's doctors, bureaucrats running AHPRA, think that is a punishable opinion. And now we're punishing doctors who protect life instead of regulating doctors who are actually harming actual patients in our actual nation. It's a great injustice, and I'm really glad that HRLA is taking up the defense of people who find themselves punished for good conscience and good faith behavior. Yeah.
Well, it's good to talk to you, and you talked about the fact that we need good news stories as well. And I often talk on the subjects that are my bread and butter that I deal with every day. And people get to the end of it and they're kind of like, oh, there's no hope. It's just this unending barrage of bad news. And that's not at all what I'm seeking to achieve. I can just talk matter-of-factly about these cases. But I'm pretty confident that even if we were to lose every single case, there's still a God in heaven. He's still in control. I've read the last page and I know who wins. And that's but there are some good stories. You want me to share you a recent success we had?
I was about to invite you to. What are some recent successes you've had? So maybe just two.
We were contacted by a teacher. He and his wife were both teaching at the same school. And when they turned up for the beginning of the calendar year of 2021, there was a child at their school who was a biological female who had decided to identify against sex as a male, and the school had then put in a policy that, yes, they were going to allow the child to identify as male and would have to be treated as male, and that all staff and all students would have to use male pronouns and the male name of this student. So there was a training session that was held to help these teachers get across what this would mean, and with a question section afterwards. And our client is an Orthodox Christian with deeply held beliefs about where identity has its source. He'd also been watching a certain Martin Iles of the Australian Christian Lobby and his regular section where he talks about Christian perspective, gives a Christian perspective on current issues. So he started asking questions about the fact that for most children, if you leave them alone, their gender confusion will desist by the time they reach adulthood, and why we would be aggressively transitioning children at a very young age when they're too young to make those decisions. He asked about Kira Bell, the famous young woman and very courageous young woman who took a case against Tavistock Clinic and won her original case when she was transitioned, and no one ever said, stop, let's ask some questions and let's find out what the real problem is. Underwent sort of life-altering surgeries and hormonal treatments, and now is living with the lifelong consequences of regret at the very young age of about 23. And so his mic got shut off. He was told to go home and to work from home if he couldn't if he couldn't use names and pronouns and treat this young girl as a boy. He wrote to the school and said, look, there's ways we can accommodate my conscientious objection. I don't want to be a problem for the school, but my classes can be taken by anyone, and it can be arranged that I don't have to teach this particular student and cause them any distress because my conscience doesn't allow me to use that name and the pronouns. The school frog marched this young guy out, gave him his leaving orders at a meeting which he had asked to have to try to explore some options for dealing with it. And so he was out of a job. His wife was still working at the place in a hostile environment, and he called us. So we took a claim in the Fair Work Commission. We took an adverse action claim. We said that they had treated him unfairly when he was exercising his perfectly reasonable workplace right to make inquiries about a new policy that had been introduced. We took it to a conciliation, and we were able to get an exceptional settlement for him where his termination was reversed and he was allowed to leave. He was given a significant amount in settlement of his claim that would allow him to pay his mortgage through to the end of the year and give him some leeway to be able to look for another job without financial pressure. We also got an apology and a statement to the rest of the school that gave him commendation for the service of 8 years that he'd had at that school, and a letter of recommendation for his employment going forward. So you can't uncrack the omelette in these situations and put him back into the situation where he was, but it was a fantastic result. And it was just something that we've been able to achieve by running cases strategically and standing up for the little guy.
That's brilliant, and a great outcome indeed. Any final thoughts before we wrap up the interview today and the conversation? Thank you again for joining. But anything that we've neglected, any questions, important issues I've failed to bring up?
There probably is a whole another hour's worth of answers to that question, Dave. I guess the big thing is on the
blank check. We'll go as long as you have time for.
No, keep these things for an hour. Otherwise, no one will ever want me to return as a guest again, including yourself.
Well, you have 5.5 minutes left then.
Yeah, okay. I guess the big thing is that what's on our plate right now federally is the Religious Discrimination Bill, and the forces of hostility towards Christians and religion in general are marshaled and efficiently organized. And while this isn't the magic law that's going to fix everything, it's a first step, and it needs people to get involved and to campaign for it and to dispel some of the clear myths that are being put out there in the media. Don't know how you do that because you have to have a voice, but certainly contacting your local members and talking about the real experiences a Christian have is a good start.
Yep.
People in Victoria are under siege, not just from massive COVID lockdowns, but from an aggressively anti-Christian legislative campaign that seems to have been given a free ride through their parliament in exchange for support for draconian pandemic laws. There seems to have been a compact made on that front, which has meant that things like the conversion therapy law passed through without any sort of real scrutiny.
Mm-hmm.
And it was on its face. It banned certain kinds of prayer, just appalling. And now they have going through their parliament a bill which is going to strip back the power, the ability of schools, Christian schools, to operate in accordance with their principles. So that's going to basically allow any activist to make application and force their way into Christian schools and completely hollow out the very ethos, the very set of values and the purpose for which those schools were established.
Yeah.
And so people need to be aware of that and be motivated to take up a voice, talk to their local politicians there in Victoria and make it very clear that this is just not acceptable.
Indeed. And if you're determined to live in Victoria, maybe you ought to consider homeschooling. Well, and I'm 100% serious about that. Look, thank you very much for your time today, John. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Well, pleasure to be here with you.
I'll just sign off and I'll come back and say g'day to you. Or goodbye, as it might be at the end of an hour. That's John Steenhoff from the Human Rights Law Alliance. You can jump onto HRLA.org.au to see more about the work that the Human Rights Law Alliance is doing to defend religious freedom and people affected by the lack thereof in Australia. And as I've said before, a really important organisation to give any support to you can financially, as well as just staying on top of the important work that they're doing, and to see just how much need there is for HRLA and religious freedom legislation in Australia. You can go to australiawatch.com.au. This legislation is not a solution in search of a problem. It is the very, very first steps in beginning to address a very real problem here in this nation. Something else you should all be aware of is that the Church and State Summit is coming up the last Saturday in February 26 in 2022, and that will be in Brisbane. We're finding it very difficult right now to find a large enough venue close enough to Brisbane, which will be very courageous and very confident in facing the risks of possible segregation and apartheid laws. We don't want to be turning anybody away. In fact, under the new Queensland apartheid laws, I won't be allowed to go to the Church and State Summit if it's held in a hotel or a function centre, a government-owned building, or even the convention centres that we were planning having it very big and very central, but that's now looking very hard. So at the very least, it will be online. But why don't you head to churchandstate.com.au/CAS22, CAS22, and join the mailing list there. We'll let you know as soon as there's any news about when, where, and how the Church and State Summit will be held. But it will be Saturday, February 26th next year. And you can follow me and recent videos, interviews, and articles that I've written at davepellowe.com, where you can also become a Pellowe Talk partner. Thanks to all the partners and supporters of The Good Source and Pellowe Talk who help keep this kind of thing happening. Without you, we couldn't do it at all. And that is a wrap, guys. That's the end of the show, and we'll see you next time we have a chat. Look forward to seeing you in the comments.
If not now, then when will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time. us to do something.